Hello, and welcome back. Or welcome, in case you have recently joined. I hope you're all nourished from the break, and we're very sorry that there was a miscommunication on the food side. I hope you still got a little bit of it, feel nourished for the second part now. My name is Sonja Höfelmann, and I work as a research lead with the Center for Humanitarian Action, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this panel here. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules, just as a reminder for those that only turn to the session now, that this will be recorded and can be watched afterwards on YouTube. There will be the opportunity to ask questions, both from the online audience, but also from those in the room here. And in an effort to make this conference more accessible, we have this screen here to have transcription. So please leave some seats here for those that wish to have a look on the monitor. If it's too small to read, you can also join the Zoom link with your phone. Just make sure that it's muted, and then you can open the transcription in a separate window. I think we heard in the previous sessions that the challenges are manifold that the humanitarian sector is facing. And this panel will focus on how organizations are reacting and changing in light of these changes, but also this increasingly hostile environment. We see that there's both a dwindling support from the public, but also from political stakeholders. We have already spoken about massive funding cuts, the remaining funding to become more transactional. That means more serving national interests. We also see more scrutiny from the public. There was some mentions to that too. Anti-aid sentiments, also securitized debates where migrants, refugees, but also diseases or pathogens are portrayed as threats, and where national security is increasingly more important than helping those in need. So the central question for this panel will be, how do aid actors navigate this uncertainty, and to not just stay on the doom and gloom, but also to look forward, how do we need to reshape organizations to become future ready? To answer all these questions, I have an amazing panel here, and I will introduce you to them as we go. We will have 2 rounds of questions to the panel, and then we'll have the opportunity for some Q&A, as I said, from both the online audience as well as from the floor here. I would like to kick us off with Eli. Eli Kennedy is a strategic foresight consultant with a decade of experience in supporting humanitarian organizations. She is the founder and director of Iran, which is a think tank dedicated to fostering collaboration in humanitarian organization and helping NGOs navigate complexity. She is the author of many influential reports, which I'm sure you've heard of, among them The Future of Aid and also From Voices to Choices. Welcome. It's really great to have you join us all the way from London, I believe. And you are currently working on a new edition of the Future of Aid report, 2040. This is the times frame that we're looking at. And I'm sure that you're paying very close attention to the trends that are shaping the humanitarian sector today. And I'm assuming that these contestations that we heard today, but also the challenges, must be a very critical part of your work in this. So I would like to turn to you for the question, what does this increasingly contested or maybe hostile, I don't know if you would frame it that way, but environment mean for aid organizations, and how do you see them responding to it?
I think the challenges were very well outlined this morning by colleagues. I think we are all also acutely aware of the challenges in the humanitarian space, both at an institutional and a personal level, and not least, as someone pointed out this morning, for the communities that we serve. So I'll focus my answer more on the reaction. And I think what we have seen quite consistently is that we are often by nature and by training reactionary in the way in which we behave and the way in which we view our work. And I think that's been exhibited very much in the response to the funding crisis that has occurred. But I think we also, by that nature, can tend to not pay as much attention to long-term trends and things that underpin it. While this is certainly a particularly acute crisis in terms of funding, it by no means started in 2025. Funding constraints have been a longer-term problem. Similarly, the politicization of aid, we are, again, in a more acute phase of that, perhaps, but it is certainly not a new trend. This is not something that we necessarily should be as surprised by as I think many of us are or have been. What we are seeing within organizations is reacting, I think, very much with a short-term lens. Some of this is by financial necessity. We have spoken with organizations who, if they were not able to lay off significant numbers of staff earlier this year, would have faced bankruptcy within a few weeks. So that is obviously an incredibly pressing challenge to which they have no choice, really, but to respond in a very reactionary way. However, there will be multiple waves of this. I don't think it's finished yet, the impacts of these funding cuts. These have not fully trickled through the system. And so what we, I think, as a sector need to consider is that reacting in the short term is not necessarily in our strategic interest. So there may not always be much scope to move. I think in speaking with a lot of CEOs, sometimes the financial realities in which they find themselves really doesn't give them much space to be able to, either the time to think strategically or even the financial leeway to be able to make decisions differently. However, I think what was clear from panel number 1 this morning is that this isn't just about a funding crisis. There's also a crisis of legitimacy. There's a deeper rooted and deeper seated challenge that exists within the humanitarian space. And I would argue that because we are so reactionary, part of this challenge is the fact that we have not implemented and have not made progress at a systems-based level on many of the commitments that we said we were going to. And what I mean by this is essentially there's a deeper crisis around principles and norms and standards within the humanitarian system. When we, as part of the Future of Aid 2040 study, have been consulting people and asked them to describe as a narrative what they think of humanitarian aid. When we asked that 40% of the people who contributed to the study have lived experience of crises, and when we focus in on their responses, they really fell into 3 themes. One was around overwhelm. Just the fact that the system can never get on top of the vulnerabilities that exist. And I think this speaks to this term that I think we need to react to the situation we have, not the situation we want. There was discussions this morning about, humanitarian action retreating back to basics, back to what we work on, and handing over to development actors. But I can't, in my career memory, remember the last time that worked. There is no one to pass the baton to. That's the situation we are in. That's the reality. So while we should be striving for ideals, we also, when we're doing practical planning, need to understand where we are today. There's a reason that we are still doing humanitarian responses after 10 years. And that is not likely to change in the near future. So as we're making our changes and our plans, and as we are reacting, we need to be cognizant of that. The other theme that came through very strongly was a theme of us versus them. A very deep-seated, a large proportion of people reported feeling very much that responders live on one planet and beneficiaries live on another. There were really evocative and very strong stories about the imbalance within the system, about the perpetuation of power structures, about the way in which we have allowed that to be for many, many decades. And I think that's also a reality we need to sit with. This isn't just about funding. This is about now in a time of crises, how are we making decisions and what are we exactly prioritizing? We have seen a lot of organizations turning inward. And I think this is part of our initial challenge because I think in the face of funding, it's very normal, it's very human to respond, to think first about your own job, to think then about your own organization, and only then to start thinking more expansively about the chain all the way down in which you'll hit. And I think that is hugely problematic because the perpetuation of INGOs is not the end goal that we share. And by reacting in a way that we are deliberately preserving ourselves, potentially at the expense of local partners, of more money going to communities, that is in fundamental breach of what a lot of us have committed to do. So I think that's our challenge. We see the extreme pressure is causing people to react in a way that is very human, in their own self-interest potentially, in their organizational interest. But in reality, if we can take a pause, if we can take a breath, look at the world as the way it is, look at the way we want it to be, and then make decisions strategically about there's going to be pain. We have had it already. Unfortunately, it is not over. But can we transform that pain into purpose and actually use that to advance some of the objectives that we've had?
Thank you. Having a frog at the most untimely moment. Thanks very much for that. When conceptualizing this panel and thinking of sort of the anti-aid trends that we see, I thought we also need some evidence to understand how the public is looking at international cooperation. And I'm very glad that we have Dr. Somin Oh with us. She's joining us online. Thank you for joining, Somin. Let me quickly introduce you to her. So Dr. Somin Oh is the Deputy Director of Development Engagement, the Development Engagement Lab based at the University of Birmingham, which is a research unit that focuses on tracking public perceptions toward international development. And she's very passionate about and has a track record of research and publishing about how individuals understand and engage with inequality, global poverty, and redistribution. She holds a PhD in political science from the Duke University. So welcome, Somin. It's really great to have you and wonderful that you can share some evidence with us to enlighten us. I have recently learned a new word. That word is vibe shift. Vibe shift means a noticeable change in general attitudes and cultural trends. And perceivably, there is a change in how the public views international engagement and, by extension, also humanitarian assistance. But perceptions are very much shaped by very recent encounters. So I'm very glad to have you with us, Somin, because you researched this much more thoroughly. So could you share with us what the evidence says about public attitudes and public engagement with international development? And maybe, if I may, if there's a difference that you see in encounters between development engagement and humanitarian assistance. Over to you.
Okay. Everyone, let me share my screen. All right. Thanks for the introduction, Sonia, and I'm excited to be part of this very important conversation. So as Sonia has briefly introduced, at the Development Engagement Lab, we have been tracking public attitudes and engagement with international development since 2019, so 7 years or so now, in 4 key donor countries. They are Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States. And today I'd like to share 3 key insights from our data around public attitudes and engagement with international development. First, as you can see on the chart, which is about public support for ODA, is that public support hasn't been too radically fluctuating in the recent time since June 2024. Support here is measured as supporting keeping or increasing the current ODA budget. And it's currently at 45% in Great Britain, over 50% in Germany, France, and the United States. And while not in the plot, 58% in Canada. But aid support has fluctuated around key events historically. In Great Britain, this was around the aid cuts back in 2020, the Ukraine crises, and Gaza. In Germany, we have seen significant drops in aid support in 2022 around the cost of living crisis, and again in 2024 during the bicycle lanes in Peru backlash. But it has now stabilized at around 53%, which could possibly be a new low equilibrium capturing a core base for support for ODA. Secondly, while we do see a stability in support levels, there are underlying attitudes that suggest that this support might still be fragile or vulnerable. There is a growing proportion of the public that believes that their country cannot afford to give aid. Around 45% in Great Britain and 30% in Germany and France. And this figure in the respective countries has doubled since 2020. So the public are increasingly thinking that they cannot afford to give aid. There's also a continued concern that aid isn't going to where it's needed, or that it's lost through corruption and not going to the intended recipients. And in the 4 countries that we monitor our data, around half of the public think this way. And it's important to highlight that not addressing these may risk losing support further during future political or media attacks on aid. And third, in the next slide, we see that public engagement with international development has also remained quite stable in the countries that we track. So we have a few items of ways that the public can engage with global poverty and development. And we see that the actions that this is the German public, take the most is around informational engagement. So 66% are reading or discussing, reading, watching, and writing about global poverty and development. 52% are discussing about it. About a much lower percentage of the population are doing more purposeful actions like voicing their opinion around global poverty and development or contacting their MPs to support ODA. Only 2% of the German public do this. And we have seen, however, a recent uptick in more informational engagement with global poverty and development. And so we have seen a change from 61% to 66%. 47 to 52% in Germany and the recent data. And this is likely due to the increased media coverage around UK aid cuts, US aid cuts, and also an increased advocacy efforts and campaigning efforts by German organizations, which is what I have heard from our partners that you're focusing your efforts on recently.
Thank you, So-Min. Maybe you can comment a little bit if this anti-aid wave, if we want to frame it that way, is also noticeable in other countries that didn't appear on the screen. Do you have any other research on other countries?
Yeah, interestingly, we have in the trends in aid support plot that I've just shared, we haven't seen a massive drop in support for ODA, and especially in the US or the UK, where the backlash has been quite prominent. And we suspect that this is capturing the core audience that are fundamentally supportive of aid due to moral reasons, their values. But as I've alluded to, this can also change due to the underlying concerns that they have around impact of aid, progress, corruption, and the efficacy or the probability that they can make a difference to the lives of those in need.
Thank you. I mean, it's, I think, to me, quite striking that these cost of living crisis and the bicycle lanes that you alluded to have such an stark impact, especially since Tamar Maloudat also alluded to that these are always choices, right, where you direct the money to, but apparently quite visible in this. Thank you. High time to turn to my next panelist, Martin Kessler. He's the director of Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe, and he is very passionate about advancing locally led and owned approaches to humanitarian action. Martin has more than 20 years of experience in humanitarian action, both in the operational context as well as in leadership roles here in Berlin. And he's currently focused on redefining Diakonie's role as an INGO and intermediary, if I understand correctly. It's an honor to have you. Thanks for joining. And I think we look all very much forward to learning more about those processes, as I just alluded to. Let me start framing my question. I recently read an article by Joël Glasman, who said that in a critique of international engagement, you can differentiate between what comes from the left, which is more a critique of the humanitarian sector being decolonial, an elitist project, let's say, versus from the right, where the critique is more that this is a betrayal of our national interests. And Glasman made this point that the sector is quite ill-prepared to respond to these critique from the right, because we for longer have focused on sort of this critique from the left. I don't want to engage in a very philosophical discussion, but I think it is of relevance in how far we as organizations are prepared in our advocacy in reacting to these anti-aid sentiments. So do you see that the need for to shift course in how we approach these critiques in responding to these anti-aid trends?
Yeah. So maybe first, thanks for having me here. Yeah, maybe I answer this from an institutional point of view, because I mean we also talk to our donors, to our private donors that also issue that critique, and I must say, yes, we receive critique, yeah, here and there. We answer it. We then choose, after one-time answering, we actually then choose not to answer it anymore, yeah, and engage in a debate. And I think this is key to this. Maybe to my next point I want to make, the anti-aid sentiments. Yes, are they really about aid is my question. Are they really about aid, or is it not something that comes from, let's say, the right-wing side that actually fights an anti-establishment, anti-woke, anti-fight, and actually instrumentalizes humanitarian aid, in this case, and criticizes it. And that has different forms. You can talk about we had the bicycle lanes, for example, yeah, they were mentioned, yeah. We can also talk about efficiency. That was also a term that came when the US aid budget was shrunk, or killed, or you can say, and these are the things. The question is, can we really, and that comes down to the point that I mentioned, can we really fight that? Is this a winnable debate? Should we actually really engage into that, yeah, and find arguments against it and start arguing? Yeah, I find this pretty difficult, because it's just an instrumentalization, and I mean we probably won't have the right arguments. Yeah, I mean we have the arguments, right? Yeah, but we will not. They will not be accepted, and we will not win this debate. So we should stick out of it, and instead, actually try to demonstrate a little bit better what we are doing. Actually, yeah, what we do. Advocacy needs to adopt our advocacy, I think. Yeah, not retreat, of course. We should increase our advocacy. We should actually talk a little bit, not so much about the Radwege, or maybe distinguish ourselves also. And I think as humanitarians, we have also the big advantage that we have the humanitarian principles, which we can go back to and say these are the humanitarian principles. And it is not development aid, yeah. And so we can somehow differentiate here between development aid and humanitarian aid. And we should actually sort of talk about what we are doing. And I mean, I believe we should actually engage into the space that we have. We should talk to the politicians, we should talk to the committees and tell them what we are actually doing, what good we are doing in the world. Yeah? And we are doing, I think, a lot of good. Yes, we do also things that we don't do good, and we should actually be self-critical as well. But I mean, I guess we have something to talk about, and we should increase the efforts to do that. We should maybe also travel to the regions. Yeah, we should also maybe go and talk to our partners. We as DKH, DKH is the abbreviation for Diakonie Katastrophe. We work with local partners only, and we have a lot of evidence in the field. We can take that evidence and bring this back to the forums here and let the partners speak. Yeah? Let the partners speak together with us also. Yeah? Bring them to the table. I think there's a lot we can demonstrate. And if we do this principle-based, and maybe there I go to the principle question, if we do this principle-based, I think that will help us. Right? That's probably the only way out, I think, here. In regard to the principles, yes, we have neutrality. We have used neutrality in the past, often also as a shield a bit, yeah. So to stick out of political debates somehow, yeah. We are neutral. We don't engage in kind of political debate. In a, let's say, more and more polarized environment, that's a bit difficult, in my opinion, yeah. So to do that, so I would probably go back to what Ramesh said this morning. Maybe we should more focus about the humanity. That's the core of the humanitarian principles, yeah, that many more people can buy into, I guess. Yeah. So if we do that, yeah, we can probably use this in the spaces we are using, and therefore somehow maybe demonstrate our legitimacy. Yeah.
Thank you. I really like your point on, is it possible to counter the narrative, or do we speak about something else to bring the attention somewhere else? You said that if there is a critique that you engage once, but then you leave it. I think very often we approach critics rather in the defensive by trying to convince that we're doing good. But maybe should we also be more open about where things go wrong? Because I think this has been a critique that we tend to say everything is great, but maybe are not so open where things go wrong. So would you say that we need to do that more? And where's also the line to draw to not engage with populist actors that just want to exploit sort of these cases?
I would probably say absolutely we should be more transparent, and we should actually also, I mean, we face all challenges as a sector, as organizations, we face these challenges, and we should talk about them. We should actually really address them and say these are the, let's say, the flaws in this sector, and we need to address it, and that's how we would like to do that, yeah? I think, and I mean, the question is, if we tackle arguments, let's say the inefficiency debate, that's a very difficult one, yeah, because the inefficiency debate, I mean, we all know it, yeah. We have these standards, the standards we have to fulfill, and these standards have created that sort of system, that machine around it, you know, and now it's branded inefficient. So we should still do it, but we should maybe focus it more, let's say, to the political aims that we have, and that is, for us, it's localization. We really want to do locally led humanitarian action, and we should say, okay, maybe that is even more efficient than the old machine that we have. And I mean, I can give you an example. For example, we just calculated this. We are working with the emergency response rooms in Sudan, yeah, and we can say 92% of the money we have committed, it's actually our own money, the unearmarked funding, because we don't get back donor funding for that, is going to this locally led action. In fact, yeah, only 8% is left in the administration, and that is very efficient. I mean, and this is something that we can somehow connect to our political long-term goals.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this argument is localization winning also as an argument with donors, private donors. I think we'll come back to this later. But it's high time to introduce also the last speaker, which is Åsa Manson. She's the managing director at FENRO, an umbrella body of development and humanitarian NGOs in Germany. Before that, Åsa worked with Wikimedia Germany as a head of strategy and governance and as head of the executive office. Åsa is very passionate about equity, advancing female leadership and accountability across global NGOs, and especially in her role with International Civil Society Center in Berlin, she advanced on that. It's a really pleasure to have you. Thanks for bringing in your perspective. I think at FENRO you have a very close ear to how the German NGOs are struggling in light of these contestations that we heard today. So maybe turning to you, what do these anti-aid shifts mean for German NGOs? And would you say that it leads to more competition or more coordination sort of in light of the threats among them?
Yes, hello, and thanks also for having me. So yes, at FENRU we have almost 150 member organizations, German NGOs working in development and humanitarian, and also on global education, global citizen education. So we have a widespread, several of our members obviously sitting here in the room. Really nice to see you today as well. So, well, I would agree with you saying we still haven't seen all the consequences of these shifts that are now happening internationally and also here in Germany. So I think it's still to be seen exactly how this will hit us and what changes it will be. But it's clear that we do feel a lot of worry. There are loads of questions in the rooms. There are loads of discussions around how to deal with this. And now we're talking about those railways again. So a few months ago, I promised someone to never talk about these railroads again, right? In the German discussion here for the international audience that we had 1 or 2 years ago, and now we're doing it again because we said let's never mention them again for the exact reason as you were saying, Martin, to let's change the discussion, right? But now we're doing it again. Well, even since then, I think we felt a lot of confusion and insecurity in the different spaces that we moderate or facilitate. And looking back at it, I'm feeling like everyone was really confused and really also shocked and struck. How can someone even criticize us? How is this even happening, right? We're doing what we're doing, and we're increasing our budgets. We're increasing also in the way we're doing things. We're still making mistakes, but still we're getting more efficient. And so how can even someone dare criticizing us? And it took us quite some time, and maybe we still haven't quite figured it out, or I think we haven't quite figured it out yet, to even realize how to communicate or how to respond to this. And I think early days we said a lot about, we have to find different ways of communicating. Let's do TikTok, all of us, right? And increasingly, I think we're feeling there are different channels and there are different messages for different target audience. So I think that's definitely something that everyone can now agree on. Whoa, we need to get better at that. And I think we're seeing as well that organizations are getting better at targeting their communication. But so there will definitely be changes. Someone also said here earlier, this is not just happening now, and I also don't think it just started 2 years ago, especially in the international sphere where I spent more of my time as well. There have been very many discussions and intense discussions for ages and ages about how to reinvent the civil society sector or the INGOs, etc. And I think we as a German community need to tap into that international discussion as well now that we're trying to figure out what this means for us. So on your question, does it lead to more cooperation or competition? I think I definitely can see signs of both. So starting on the good side, we would obviously like to see much more collaboration and working together. I think within the German sector, there are really good examples for many years, that we have come together, doing things together, jointly advocating various projects, various things. And I do feel and see signs of let's do this now even more intensely together, because you have 0.5 FTE less than I do too, right? So let's make this together, and let's see how we can become a even more powerful voice if we speak up together. I also see examples of solidarity within the sectors where some organizations that are not yet or might not at all be hit by the national or federal budget cuts are sharing their resources. Really, I saw that, I was told about an example, one organization saying, we still have the budgets because we're 80 or 90% private donors, so how can we now support those organizations that are 80-90% federal money? So those are definitely signs as well. And one thing that I do want to raise as us talking about civil society actors, we see also in Germany by now attacks, I'd call them, on civil society actors on the work that we're doing, which is something that we really need to attend to and that we really need to focus in on, and we do that in FENRU as well. But this is also something that really fosters solidarity, is my feel. So it's not a good thing, right? Because obviously we wouldn't want to have these attacks. But how can we use those spaces where we come together to talk about the role of us as civil society to also then to get to know each other and to foster collaboration? So that on that, but yes, I also see signs of competition. At our organization, we have loads of different spaces for representatives of member organizations to come together on different topics, and that's always, I'd say, been in a spirit of, sharing and what have you heard and what have I heard, and hey, can you tell me what those guys said, and I'll share with you the latest intelligence. And we're already feeling, or I'm being told by my colleagues, and this is a very unfortunate development if this is being confirmed as we go, that this is now, everyone is pulling back a bit, like maybe I won't share that piece, and maybe so, and things like that. And I think this is something that the CEOs or the leaders in the room really have to attend to make, if you agree with me, that is, that this is something that we don't want to see, and we really need to come together, and still we can only be stronger as a community if we continue sharing in solidarity with each other what we are doing. And I mean, I'll stay with that. We'll come back to, I'd like to talk about the messaging thing and how we can do that. And again, since we have both development and humanitarian, we have different voices, but how can we do that? And maybe that's my last thing then on coordination and coming together. I really do think that we have to link our international justice topics, if I may sort of summarize them like that, with with national justice topics. We really need to talk about these things as parts of human rights, as democracy, as, the loads and loads of people. We've seen it from Sumi, if it's 53% in Germany, and we see it confirmed from other numbers. There are very many people out there that do support what we're doing, and we need to connect with them, and we need to convince them or share with them or engage in the conversation about what we're doing is also linked to the values that they are having. So I think that's the challenge to a large extent.
Thank you. I would have a follow-up question to you, if I may. So in the morning, we asked in a very short poll among the audience here what they think of the reset, the humanitarian reset and Fletcher's agenda. And a lot of votes got for the answer, it's an overdue conversation. So I wonder, in a bit of a provocative way, but is it good to be challenged in a way? Because, now maybe there is a momentum to sort of clear the cellar out or address, some of the projects that even we have been a bit uncomfortable as organizations to have run those. So, to be a bit provocative, is Trump actually helping us to have these uncomfortable conversations?
That's to me, right? The question goes to me.
Feel free to comment.
I'll hand on the mic to you. Obviously, I think disruption or pressure is needed for us to change, right? Again, comparing sort of the German conversation with the international, it's a different one, if I may be bold like that. Well, I do think these kind of challenges, the drastic ones, without any sort of warning, I think this is not helping us necessarily, because you were saying it as well. This leads to us it's not helping in focusing on the right things. Many of us are focusing on our own houses, our own organizations, because for the reason you mentioned, and we all know them, and this is not helping us guiding the attention to what we need to be talking about and to make those long-term strategic decisions. So no, I don't think it's helping us that we're looking at it like this. We could have seen this disruption come in other ways, and maybe the other warning systems, and then that would have helped us. So no, but we're here and this is where we're at, so let's deal with it in the smartest way.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, we'll do another round here on the panel, but please also prepare your questions. We will want to keep time for those as well. So the second round here on the panel should be a bit of a future outlook. And the idea, as introduced in the beginning, is also to focus on organizational readiness. How can we change the organizations that we work in to be ready for the things to come? And Martin, I know that Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe put a lot of thinking into, and maybe some painful choices, I don't know, into restructuring the organization as an intermediary that takes locally led and owned approaches very seriously. But I wonder if there's a dilemma, on the one hand, to balance building a decolonial and locally empowering intermediate organization, while at the same time safeguarding organizational survival on the other hand in terms of these more harsh climates or environments. Is that mutually exclusive, or is that a dilemma, or do you see that not being the case?
It's absolutely a dilemma, of course. And I mean, I remember, I think it's a couple of years ago, I said internally that we actually need to have the goal to make ourselves obsolete. That didn't go down with everyone very well, yeah, of course, yeah, because you don't want to be obsolete, yeah, of course, yourself, you don't. I mentioned then as well, of course, I don't know if that's, I mean, if that should be the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal should be, in fact, to engage more in localization, in locally led approaches, and invest into these ones. And if the outcome is that we are obsolete, fine. Then we have changed the world. That's nice. Then let's focus on other issues. Yeah, there's that's. But how likely that is another question. Then and then then you can speculate on your lifetime how much you can achieve there. So, but I mean, I think it should be our ultimate goal. Should be. I mean, we want to lead locally. Or local organizations led humanitarian actions wherever they are. And I mean, I often have these debates also in the German society, because we work here in Germany in the flood responses, you know. And I mean, people, I tell them sometimes, in those circles where I am, I tell them sometimes, you know, I come from the Philippines, and in the Philippines they do this far better than in Germany. Maybe they should come and help us here, yeah? What? Why? Why the Philippines? You know, and then you can explain why. Yeah, because of course they are very good in these systems. You know, far much better than we are. Yeah, and we can learn from them. Yeah, but I think that demonstrates actually. I turn this then around and say this is the same thing when we go to Sudan or somewhere else. Yeah, people actually have the capacities, or if they don't have, they want the capacities and want to address humanitarian crisis themselves. And this is what we try to focus on. I mean, for us, it's a constant process of self-reflection. In fact, yeah, we always have to think about. What is it, the role? There are a lot of dangers, in my opinion, in the localization debate. Yeah? So, I mean, we ourselves also have undergone now, or we are undergoing now, into a decentralization process. So we transfer, of course, capacities to our regional offices. Yeah? There lies a lot of danger in it, because we can just repeat what we do here. Yeah? So changing the attitude there within the organization, say, no, we do this because we can assist the transition process a bit better than we can do that from here. Yeah, that's a thing. We need to be authentic in that, and I mentioned that before. Yeah, we need to be open and transparent, and also ask ourselves: constantly ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? Honesty is essential for me. Yeah. We have to ask ourselves, how local are we really? Yeah. So I mean, if I look let's say into our own structures, of course we face challenges as well. We have structural costs that are high, and those costs that we cannot share with the local partners, which we would like to do more. Yeah. So how can we strike the balance here? So it's a constant sort of fight against yourself in the end. Yeah. And of course also with let's say with the larger donor environment, yeah, because there it's also not so much supported. I mean, we have this 25% from the grand bargain. Yeah, they are there. Yeah, so now everyone jumps on those 25%, and yeah, for me the question is really. What do we draw from that? Yeah, what type of localization are we doing? Are we repeating? Let's say, are we recreating what was mentioned? What was the bourgeoisie? The local bourgeoisie. Okay. Are we doing that, or what is it? How can we support those locally led approaches? And then we reflect constantly. We have this leaflet that was mentioned there, yeah, that we have put out our role as an intermediary. We have discussed this internally a lot, and this is also a permanent debate, yeah, because we have old humanitarians with us, yeah, that say no, we do this and that, and then we have internal debates. We have those local actors that are actually acting as international ones, but that's what we have to face. We have a constant debate on those issues and have to redefine it. That's what I can make out of that.
But if we look, there you mentioned this example from I think Sudan with the emergency response support that you fund out of your own funds. If we look towards dwindling public support, maybe an aging society as well, maybe dwindling support from governmental sources, do you think this challenge will be even greater in the future when there's less funding coming into DKH as an organization, at the same time saying or approving the work that you do and maintaining this approach, we are only the intermediary, we are only the facilitator?
I mean, maybe in the debates I am with in our faith-based sector, I see different approaches. Yeah? So there's organizations that say we have our own church-based funding that's free. We can use it for exactly what we want to do, and we're out of it. Yeah, which means basically we cut 50% of our assistance that we have. Yeah, somehow. Yeah, Christian Aid is an example. For example, they follow that approach. Others do that too. Then there's the other group that says we want to stay in the game. We want to somehow continue with the funding that we get from our donors, but then we have to engage them into a debate. And I think this is the more what I would call the hybrid approach. Yeah, and there, of course, we have to constantly lobby for what we do. Yeah? Working with the ERRs is not financeable by back donors, or very difficult financeable by back donors. Why? Because they don't comply to those standards. Yeah? We give them funds and we get a report of what they have done. Yeah? We don't get a grid what they want to do, where they want to do it, with whom they want to work, and so on. Yeah? We have to trust them. Yeah? We give them we have a reporting, but that I cannot go to, and I cannot get a back donor financing that only if I can make a sort of a whole regional approach maybe, and I bring other actors in. But that's the debate we have to have, in fact. Yeah, we have to constantly address this with our back donors. I mean, institutionally, maybe to mention that it's not only the internal debates that we have. Also, I mean, we try to bring as much as funding as possible to local actors. Yeah, and that was last year 52 million euros that we have funded local actors. We try to invest into capacity strengthening measures, 11 million euros. Yeah, we do institutional the Aniermarkt funding we share with the partners. Yeah, so also that we do. We have a policy on that one, and so we try on those on those levels really to do as much as possible.
Thanks very much. I think Martin, also turning to you, mentioned also finding new roles. Martin mentioned the mutual exchange, maybe Philippine organizations supporting Germans in response to natural disasters here. But you also alluded to maybe finding new roles on national justice arguments or topics. So I think humanitarian organizations have emphasized for a long time this apolitical character of their work. And I'm wondering, in sort of the face of more authoritarian tendencies and more populist actors on the rise, you also mentioned the attacks against civil society actors. If NGOs that are also present here in the room need to find a new role or also a new voice at home. At home, I mean, the countries that they originated from, the German NGOs, obviously from Germany. So do we need to be more outspoken in our advocacy? Do we also need to shift on the advocacy, as Martin mentioned, shifting maybe from neutrality to humanity? How would you see that?
I think each and every organization needs to figure this out for themselves, right? I don't think there's a one recipe the same for everyone, but I do think that organizations need to ask themselves this question. Again, we were talking about target audiences and messages and those things before. So I think within looking at our membership with almost 150 organizations, each of them will have to, and we can facilitate that conversation, right? Or the exchange and the discussion for them to do that. But I do think everyone needs to sort of take a step back and figure out, are we going down this road? Are we using these arguments? Are we using these arguments? These are our constituencies, right? These are the ones that we are talking to, and then others have others. So I think that really makes a difference. I think we can see it in the US for sure. I'm not super close to the entire debate, but definitely examples of some civil society organizations sort of saying, "Oh, let's stay sort of silent, and let's take stuff up from our website." And they do that, respect that it will have their reasons. I'm hoping for them to do that. And we have other examples where very much outspoken, standing up and saying we will never change anything, so whatever it takes, whatever will come our way because of this, and everything in between, right? So I do think that each organization would need to figure this a bit out for themselves. Saying that though, maybe that's not something that I should be saying, because from an association perspective, we are trying to keep the organizations that we are working for together and to sort of also speak with one voice. Maybe that's not the smartest thing to say, so sorry for saying that without being smart about it, because I do think it might lead to, now looking at our 150 or so, we have very many smaller organizations as well, so maybe 60 or so that are really active in advocacy. If you guys all take different roads here and say, we're going to continue promoting a feminist foreign policy, for example, because we do believe in it and we stand to this, and we don't care so much about whether the German official policy is that or not. We've been working, I have members who are saying we've been working with feminist policies for the last 30 years. Obviously I wouldn't change it now because some German policies change, they should do whatever they want. We are staying true to that. And then we have other organizations, and I can respect that very much as well, and everything in between, again saying, hey, we're not going to use those terminology, we wouldn't use those words at the moment. They're really red flags for so many of our constituencies. That's a lot of difficult conversations with politicians. So we will choose to not do that. And to use other words, and maybe they're saying we're still true to, gender equality and all this. And so we are seeing different roads, and I think the most important thing is that each organization checks in on themselves and says what's the right road for us. But again, saying that, the challenge for me and for us within FENRU might potentially be to bring all these then under one roof and say, okay, what are we now saying? Is everyone still okay with still being organized under the FENRU roof? Because these are our messages. So being very open about the challenges that we're currently having, and where we're trying to support organizations in finding their way, and we're also trying to find the right way for us as an organization in this challenging climate where things that we have been saying for the last few years are now being questioned in a different way, and how do we deal with that, and what's the smartest way. So we're still dealing with it for us, but I do think there are loads of conversations to be had still.
Thanks very much for those frank words. And since we also have a lot of representatives here in the room, maybe you feel free to also speak up or comment on how you see this within your organizations. Turning to you, I think we also alluded to the dilemma in the morning between saving organizations versus transforming as a sector. And I think in the beginning, when the US aid dismantling started and everyone was sort of in shock, there was a lot of talks if there will in the future be a lot of mergers of organizations. How do we scale down now? Maybe there's also this hidden hope or wish that with a new US administration, funds will go up again, and this is just, a valley, but eventually things will continue, and how do we maintain to scale up at some point? So I think leaders face a lot of very challenging questions in these times. And with the reset going on, I think there's also discussion that focus on what competencies do we have as organizations, where do our strengths lies, and structures as well. So maybe since you work a lot on complexities, but also on a future outlook, how do organizations need to reshape and reform to become future ready? I know this is a very broad question. But I think this is what you also look at within your report.
Yes, I think I think a lot of the discussions that we have noticed being had are very much at a tactical level. So we've heard people talking about mergers, about scale downs, about moving here, moving there. And fundamentally, I think we have skipped a step, which speaks a bit to what Martin outlined. And I think it, again, goes back to this question. We heard a bit this morning about reinforcing basics and going back to basics. I actually think that's fundamentally in the wrong way, and I'm going to make myself very unpopular. But I think the fact of the matter is we have to question the basics. There is a lot of pushback against the basics when you talk with local organizations often and with communities, even within our own organizations. There hasn't been a significant amount of research on this. There should be more. But, looking at the UN Reset, for example, that still, the starting assumption was that the UN is still the center of the system. It was not a question as to whether or not that's still an optimum way to run things. That was the point. How can the UN be more effective? And I think we are in danger of doing the same thing. Of the starting point being, how can we shrink so we can scale up later? How can we manage and make it through a hard time? How can we consistently ensure that this is the way we're working? And I think fundamentally, it takes a huge amount of courage. And transparently, it's not pleasant. It's not going to be nice and easy. We seem to have this fallacy that the commitments to localization we made, 10 years ago at the Grand Bargain, but even longer ago than that, would come by continually growing the pie of money and power, that we wouldn't shrink, but there would just be more space for local actors. I have never believed that that would be true. There will be a cost to this. So again, we're facing that cost now, whether we like it or not. So the question is, do we have the courage to do this in a way that actually advances our values? And I think that means going one step further back. We shouldn't start from the conversation of, is a merger tactical, or is this the way we go? I think we need to fundamentally reevaluate basics and reconsider humanitarian principles as a whole. I think the point today of humanity being the only enduring one, I think that reflects reality, honestly. I know we talk a lot about neutrality and independence and impartiality. I have not seen that lived well by almost any humanitarian organization. You need only look at funding to Afghanistan to notice when it spikes, and it's very obvious why it spiked, and when it's going down again. We follow the money because that's our very nature of what we're doing. And by that effort, we are naturally political within that frame. I think pretending we're not is what is also eroding our legitimacy. We're not honest in this conversation. We're also not honest about localization. As we're seeing now, many organizations are looking at ways to temporarily scale down, maintaining the same structures, the same power dynamic, the same way of making decisions, but just shrink, and to the minimum. We're not really engaging in a conversation of how can we actively work differently. And it is so needed. Studies, even from 2020, have said and outlined, the number of staff who are people of color and minority groups who say they experience racism at working in the UN, in international NGOs. When you talk with people from localization, they will say from local organizations, racism is one of the reasons this isn't moving forward. We don't unpack any of this at fundamental level by concentrating on mergers and tactics and budgets and money. So I think we need to use this chance to go all the way back and unpack some of that a lot more. Well, this is the thing. There's a lot of, I think, because of who we are as humanitarians and because of who we are as colleagues, on a personal level, we understand that. But that's so difficult to operationalize because it has, you will have, many of you are decision makers. You have teams, you know them, they have families, there's a not, it is in practice very difficult. When we support on restructures and things, even things like decentralization, for decades there have been issues then of, every meeting we go into and we're helping with strategy, someone says, absolutely, it's a great idea. Localization, totally on board. I think it's wonderful. I think it should be that team though, not so much my team, but I think that's the one that's got to go first. And I think that it's just fundamentally human. And we are human, and that kind of, we have to allow for that kind of issue. But I also think this is the second point. After going back to basics and being more honest with ourselves about what's practical and we're actually going to do, because let's not make promises we're not going to keep, and let's also be honest about the reality in which we face, we then have to let other people define our value add. So this is also another issue. If we ask ourselves what's our added value in the system, without really asking local partners and communities, you're going to get the answer you want, which I think is a little bit part of what's happened at the reset, right? You kind of ask a constituency a question that's leading in a way that gives you the answer that you want. And that, again, is a risk, right? I mean, it's a risk in the sense that it pushes you away from true transformation. It might be the more comfortable road. And so I think what we're trying to do through the Future of Aid 2040 project, I encourage all of you to join it, is to then, we have at this point scenarios that we need to try and manage. The future is not looking easy from the perspective of humanitarian work. One of the scenarios titled created by the community is Empires of Aid, where aid is much more transparently and openly a tool of full geopolitical leverage. You know, how can we live in that world and pretend to still have humanitarian principles? These are fundamental questions for us to address. And I think what we need to do is to ask local organizations in these different kind of futures, what's the kind of response you want to mount? What's the kind of response you can mount? Let's have that be the starting conversation. And then we need to use that to define our value add that complements that and supports that. We can't start the value add conversation at home without understanding better, you know, where are we, what are we trying to build upon? Because we shouldn't be there first. And I think that is a hugely fundamental issue. So I don't see a huge amount of benefit to mergers necessarily. I think the last one we had in the sector specifically was when Save the Children sort of swallowed Merlin whole. I don't think it was necessarily a merger so much as a takeover. We might have similar episodes. I think realistically there may be times where organizations simply decide at a level of funding it's not worth continuing. I don't think that's necessarily, that is not per se a bad outcome. I think if we're leading with courage and we're making sure that the communities that organization served are being served by others, that we're transferring capacity in the most effective way, I don't think that is per se a problem. I think it's just not pleasant. And I think that's really difficult because we have a few years left, I think, of this conversation to go through. I think it's just a question of, are we entering this conversation from a position of leadership in terms of saying, this is hard, we have to react, we have to respond, let's do it in a way that delivers on our values? Or are we entering this in still a very reactionary mode of saying, we've just got to keep going and we have to maintain what we have and like the light will come at the end? And I think that's an issue that we have. And the problem is time is very thin on the ground. And so I think having space for people to try and have those difficult conversations is important.
Thanks very much. I think, one of the uncomfortable truths that have come up is in fact that the pie is not getting bigger, but we're also not shifting who gets how much of this pie. Soman, I would like to turn to you again for an intervention from your work. I think what became evident, or what we talked about in the panel, is also a need to shift a bit in the advocacy work. And I think there's a lot of questions on how do we best make the case for aid, and what messages sort of appeal to the audiences that we're trying to reach. And I think it was interesting, the graph that you showed, in how do people engage with the topic of international cooperation, and reading messages sort of was the highest. So it's a very superficial level of engagement, if I may put it a bit bluntly. But I think you test for this as well, like what aid messages work. And I think we've spoken a little bit about countering a narrative, or just, showing different examples and not engaging specifically on these deconstructive or critical narratives. So maybe over to you for some evidence on this.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question. So I think the screen is sharing. We do have a lot of work on messages and framings that work with the public in general, and also messengers. I know that organizations have been trying to test new messengers, unusual messengers that work with the public. And so we have just recently done work around it, which can be found on our website. So our research points to 3 broad categories of messages that work with the public in the 4 countries that we track. And the first and foremost, the frame that performs consistently well is soft morality. The framing aid as helping those in need as the right thing to do, and coupling that with specific benefits of making the world a healthier, safer, and more secure place, like vaccinations, countering inflation, supply chain disruption, climate change, for example, that resonates with the wider audiences, whereas more of a hard morality, like providing aid is the right thing to do for Germany, for instance, it doesn't perform as well. Secondly, value for money and impact are really important. As you can see on the plot in Germany, in particular, the most effective frame is you can do a lot of good in poor countries with few resources. Almost half of the German public agree with this statement. And so we can glean from here that cost effectiveness and impact of aid is driving support for ODA. But this can also cut both ways. The argument that the skeptics agree with the most is that Germany is already doing a fair share despite economic strains, or that investments in ODA haven't shown visible outcomes. And so what we can see here is we need to really highlight that aid works and that aid delivers to communicate effectively with the public. In terms of countering a narrative, we have found that acknowledging skepticism and concerns of the skeptics can be persuasive. So when we acknowledge that there is waste, corruption, and loss in government, but overall aid can still help make things better, that actually helps rebuild support among the skeptical audiences. And we see that across many surveys that we have run. And secondly, among the more security-focused audiences and aid skeptics, messages that link migration, such as aid helps reduce the number of refugees coming to Germany, actually gains traction amongst these audiences. But the point isn't that you should lead with migration or waste, but the point is to acknowledge the concerns to help build and rebuild trust from the more skeptical audiences. And just wanted to go back to Asa's point previously that we need to link our international justice topics with national justice topics. And we have recently seen an uptick in this mutual benefits argument that was not present before, especially in Great Britain, that especially amongst the conservative audiences, they have been increasingly agreeing more that aid benefits Britain's national security at the same time as aid benefiting providing basic needs to developing countries like water, sanitation, and health. And it's the first time that they have moved in tandem in our June 2025 survey. And so we think that this might be a window of opportunity to broaden the reach of the audience with these right messages.
Thanks very much, Somin. Maybe one follow-up question and then we'll open for the Q&A. If you see a conflict with localization or sort of shift the power messages as opposed to other ones, is that something where people see more engagement in?
It's interesting that when we test public reactions to traditional models of aid versus localized models of aid, most people say, wait a second, I thought that's how it was already done, especially in focus groups. And so it's promising that the public is open to localization. The progressive audiences like it for fairness, equity. The conservatives value the self-reliance, like teaching a man how to fish. That's a phrase that comes up a lot in focus groups. But the tension is that while the substance of localization resonates with the broader public, the language often doesn't. So words like decolonization, shifting the power, it feels too political or too much of a jargon to much of the public. So I think the challenge is aligning communications with the values of the public. So talking about fairness, partnership, and local leadership in ways that can bring them along their journey. And it's through using traditional and everyday language around need, effective community, vulnerability, that elicits greater support and relatability with the wider public.
Thanks very much. Very encouraging to hear, I think. We have 20 minutes left for a Q&A, and I would like first to turn to my colleague Darina, who has been monitoring the online engagement.
Yes,
over to you.
Thank you very much to the panel. It was really interesting listening to you. I just have one intervention from the online audience, and it really links very nicely to what Edith just referred to, like about working differently. We've been talking about local leadership a lot, but local organizations see that affected families do not actually label their challenges as humanitarian, as development, as peace related, or as climate related. Yet the sector continues to do so while many local actors work across these different dimensions. So she's asking, is the current reset a chance for doing things differently also in that sense?
Maybe we collect a few, and I believe there's a few mics circling, so we have a question here and a question here and one in the back.
I have two questions. One is like since morning, I haven't seen any discussion about the role of the governments. For example, the space has been shrinking for most of the actors, like be it local or INGO. And then instead of opening up, it's getting closer and more rigid in order to operate. The second, the discussion about the southern intermediaries, like the organizations, those are emerging and very successfully, strategically, steadily going for diaspora funding or philanthropic funding, very stable and establishing their legitimacy in country and also the Western countries from where they are getting it. How do we see that kind of a complementarity as a Northern INGO? How do we see the role of the partnership truly making it more sustainable? So it will be good to get some insight from leaders, like how these two actors, the government and southern intermediaries, could be helpful for our going forward way.
Thank you. Then there was one here.
Thank you to the panelists for this very, very substantive conversation. I hope you allow me to be a bit provocative in order to keep the reflection very high, because I think you made a very strong point. We all know here that the localization and the meaningful localization, as you rightly pointed out, is the right way to go. But are we not, all of us, working on an assumption that this is what it will be rewarded or incentivized by I would say, the world of tomorrow? I'm not sure. Look at why USAID disappeared so violently. It is, to my view, also because they took a very brave, courageous step towards localization under the leadership of Samantha Powers, and that was considered as a threat, even like as a lose of power by banning the US, and maybe that contributed to the fact that they were very much targeted. So my question back to you, which is a bit provocative, is that should we also not think about other arguments or other homeworks, very difficult ones? Let's see, for example, in the EU, with the rising power of the right wings, etc., which is more, waiting for us to tell how many jobs do we create internally? How many of the European companies do we procure? It's very transactional, it's very egoistically, I'm sorry to say. But I think this conversation is rising. So how can we balance the two is a question back to you. Thanks.
Thanks. And there was one in the back. And then we'll close and distribute.
It was mentioned how surprised we were when the German press picked up on the bicycle lanes in Peru. My question to Sumin, in the UK, the public sort of had the same experience about a decade earlier with the Spice Girls of Ethiopia, which was a popular band, a girls' band in Ethiopia, spreading messages of hygiene promotion and girls' empowerment, etc. And they were sort of torn apart in the press.
My question is, do you have any recommendation? Are there any lessons learned from the fact that the UK aid community has kind of 10 years more experience dealing with that sort of criticism from the wrong side?
Thanks very much. Maybe we start with the first question from the chat with you. Would you like to take that? So it was on relabeling needs from sort of the bottom-up view and humanitarian sector, actors dissecting it into sectors. And maybe you would also like to comment on the question here on incentivizing the work of tomorrow.
I mean, it's an excellent point from the one online. The conversations that we have in rooms such as these are often very different from the conversations you have with communities. This is one of these issues of why I actually fundamentally think the segregation between humanitarian and development work, completely arbitrary, utterly blurred. I have never seen it work effectively. At no point is someone like, there's a switch, okay, we're going, like humanitarians out the door, development actors are coming in, that's the way it's working. That's why we have all been working in contexts where you probably started your career 10, 15, 20 years ago, and guess what? Your humanitarian action is still going 10, 15, 20 years later. If this is the point, so this is, again, back to the reality that we live in. And communities live in that reality. They don't have the academic veneer that we often privilege ourselves to have, to say, okay, well, this part is humanitarian, so I'm box ticking it here. This part is development, so we're keeping it over there. And this is a huge issue with how we're approaching massively systemic problems. When we look at food security, for example, the humanitarian end is on acute and access. The development end could be on agricultural development, production, livelihoods. By disarticulating these two things, humanitarian actors can undermine completely domestic systems of agricultural production through the way in which they intervene. And development actors can build limited resilience to shocks within that way. It is not effective. We have demonstrated for decades it is not effective. And communities know this. They understand that if farmers near them aren't growing food, if it has to be imported, they're dependent on price spikes and global fluctuations. There's very little space in the market for that to work. So it doesn't take the master's degree that I'm sure everyone in this room has to be able to understand that. And yet, this is still a lot of the conversation that we have. So I think fundamentally, we need to get out of our own box and listen to communities more when they talk to us about what they need and the kinds of systems, the way that they see problems. It makes more sense. We probably have 200 master's degrees within this room, and that would make more sense. So I think that is a huge issue. We kind of also use language as a way to other people, to exclude people. We're very jargonistic, and there is like an entry fee to kind of being humanitarian. It's like a little club. It's nice to be in it. And we can be quite exclusionary about who belongs in that club. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground of who's actually doing the work and serving communities. This is sometimes true, I find, as well with the reaction on faith-based organizations. There's sometimes a discussion about, if you have a faith-based mandate, what does that mean in terms of principled action? When we were doing the original humanitarian report in 2016, that was a conversation that was raised often, despite the fact that it's only raised often here. Communities that we serve, there's much higher levels of religiosity among communities that we serve than there is here in the West. And we impose that dichotomy on these groups without that understanding. So I think we need to get out of our heads a little bit. And is the reset an opportunity to act differently? Yes, but only if we're willing to engage in those kind of fundamental conversations. If what we're looking to do is to perpetuate the same structures but shrink it, then no, ultimately it's not. It'll be the same. To your question about sort of localization, is that the way to go tomorrow? I think yes, fundamentally, because it also links to your question about the governments. Ultimately, we have, this idea that the only capacity that's developing is capacity we built, fundamentally wrong. So capacity is increasing, local organizations have a lot of leadership. Ultimately, the majority of humanitarian responses don't happen by us. They happen by people at community level through diaspora funding. They happen by people tapping local networks. They happen through local faith-based networks. There are lots. ODA is actually a very small proportion of the money that helps communities who are vulnerable. And I think, so part of this question around localization is, can we get with that program? It's going to happen anyway, I think. It's already happening. And with increased connectivity, with sort of more access to online tools, we're better able to move money, better able to raise money individually. We see more episodes of mutual aid. I think that's all going in that direction. So I think the question is, are we like slowly gliding into obsolescence, which is not a particularly graceful way to go, in my opinion, or are we able to kind of lead that charge? But I think it also sparks something that I think you have raised very accurately, which I think, again, is a fundamental conflict that we need to resolve within ourselves. I think, and this is a huge outcome, or like a very main thread of the Future of Aid study that we're leading on, which communities reflected on, which is ultimately a lot of what we consider to be principled humanitarian action, firstly, is almost impossible to implement today and is likely to only get harder. Realistically, in this like wave in which we are in of nationalism, of increasing securitization, of really a change in agendas within that space, things that have been bubbling beneath the surface are now freely, openly claimed as part of that, right? And so I think it depends in which ways governments are looking at it. I think, and it depends how much, as also we're saying, you're willing to talk their language. So I think in terms of if self-preservation is your goal, might be, then I think it's a question here for you in terms of saying like, okay, well, you know what, that's going to be security, that's going to be migration security language in Europe. You know, can you demonstrate that you are keeping more people on that side of the Mediterranean than on this side of the Mediterranean? You might not be comfortable with using that language. That is a conversation all organizations are going to have. But that may well be the way to get money, and practically you'll be able to do more with the money you get using that language than you'd be able to do by having no money at all. So that's one choice. Another choice is to sort of try and articulate localization also within that vein. Somit was interestingly outlining sort of some of the ways in which that can be articulated within the UK. And part of the goal of localization is sort of establishing self-sustaining networks, right? That actually you don't need to be paying all of our salaries. It's going to operate kind of the way it does here, where you have local civil society, where the government is first, there's more capacity. Local civil society fills holes that the government doesn't have. And only in like extremists do you have extra international support that comes in. That is an argument that I think you could happily sell to donors, because a lot of them are cutting the budgets and they don't necessarily want to pay that money anymore. I think the only sort of like fly in that ointment of analysis is the idea that the only money that I think will stay is money that is intended to be used politically. Any money that is truly humanitarian should be localized. Any money which countries are deliberately spending in a way to advance their own agendas, they may not want to spend that way. We see that with cash. We see that domestically. There's a reason universal basic income hasn't taken off, even within Europe. You know, people don't trust poor people to make decisions, and we want that power ourselves. So I think it's just about being honest about how we navigate those spaces, because to be honest, there's not a lot of room to do that well, and people are going to do it very differently, and I think we need more tolerance of that. We tend to be very restrictive about what humanitarian action is, and I think ultimately that's going to have to change. It'll be regional, there's more humanitarians, more space in humanitarian culture than we accept.
Thanks very much. Maybe, Martin, can I turn over to you for the question over here on the South Run intermediaries and the complementarity. And I'm not sure if I got your first question right. Yeah. Over to you.
On the role of the government. Yeah. Exactly. I think there's a big role for the local governments, of course. Yeah, of course, they are legitimate players. I mean, they want to take responsibility for their affairs in their own countries, and why shouldn't they? They should actually. They have the main mandate, in my opinion, to do that. Yeah, okay. We know certain places where that is not necessarily the place where that is challenged, or where local governments are, let's say, fighting actors in a conflict or so. Yeah, then it might be a bit more difficult. Yeah? But by principle, of course. I mean, I go back to the debate that I referred to within the German crisis, with the Philippine people that I mentioned. Yeah, I mean, it's a German government that wants to take and has to take the role of coordination and organizing a response, a humanitarian response, of course. And we should not exclude them in the debate. Yeah? And interestingly, I was at the flagship learning event last year, and I mean, we were sitting together. There was senior also UN representatives, government representatives, and community representatives. And I mean, the dynamic there was very interesting, in fact, because your community said, you and your silos, you and your clusters and your sectors, we don't need that. We want this and this and this, and we want to address this together with the governments, with our local governments. So what's your role here? The answer, okay, I spare you that one. Yeah, of course. The question was then from the UN side. So how can we do that with our clusters? Actually, how can we address this? And I don't think they found an answer to that. Yeah, but these are the challenges, and these are the rightful questions that should be asked, in my opinion. And on the southern intermediaries, this is exactly, that's a very positive development. I mean, and I also would also like to, I mean, say that in many debates we tend to be sort of living in our own bubble in a way. Yeah, it's the UN, it's our system, it's the clusters, it's the talks we are having. Yeah. And we ignore what is happening on the other side. You know, I mean, there's the Qatar Trust. Okay, they may not sort of do the work according to our principles that we have defined once. Yeah, but I mean, in the end, there's a lot of help done on the ground everywhere. Yeah, through the diaspora. You mentioned that. Yeah, and through local consortia that may not comply to our standards, so therefore they are out. Yeah. This is not to be ignored, and I think our obligation is to engage with those actors. Yeah, to really see where can we somehow help here or assist here in these systems or support those systems. Yeah, where is their gap that they can't really address, and can we play a role in this?
Thanks very much. Next, Solman, I would like to turn to you on the question of recommendations and on the comparison between the Peru bicycle lanes as opposed to the Ethiopian Spice Girls.
Thank you for the really good question. I think there's a few key lessons that we can draw from the UK experience around Spice Girls. First is that silence is risky. So in the past, many of the UK INGOs have avoided engaging publicly with the criticism, hoping that it would pass, but silence has allowed hostile narratives to take root unchallenged. And in a similar vein, when we have seen that when NGOs don't own the narrative, others will, often with some distorted facts or political spin around it. So UK organizations have learned it the hard way, the importance of more value-led storytelling. And so the key lesson here from the UK experience is for a more proactive and value-led communications that resonates with the UK values around fairness, shared humanity, everyone deserves to be treated equally, etc., that we have just seen. And less of more defensive rebuttals or jargon. In terms of the audiences, there is a risk of polarization. Some UK actors have focused on defending aid to the progressives, but it left the moderates and the center-right voters disengaged or felt left out or hostile. And so engaging with a broader base without losing the core values is really important to rebuilding that long-term support in Germany. The Great Britain still, I think, faces this dilemma between or tension around which audience that they should be targeting, because targeting too much on the center-right audiences may risk losing the progressive and vice versa. And I'm curious to see what the organizations in Germany will do as a response as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So a very clear call to be prepared as a collective as well. And while we may not be having such a destructive media landscape as the UK on these topics. We don't know if it's shifting. We're actually out of time. I thought it was addressed, but would you like to comment? Sorry, I didn't give you the floor.
I just wanted to thank you for
please.
the point on the USAID and the sort of the idea of the point of, is this the reason why this happened, what happened? Okay, let's just assume it is, and then let's close our eyes and fast forward 4 years in Germany, and we will see what happens there. But I have no, illusions. I think that's also a problem in our sector, that we tend to hope that it's not going to get that bad as it gets, right? And then so far it's already getting worse. So we really have to stay realistic. And then what do we then have to do in the next 4 years so that when it happens, another government in place, because we do have a social strong junior partner, but still partner in the German government. So this is also the role of the northern governments to be very strong there. But in 4 years, we sit here again. What have we done to avoid what happened to USAID? I think that's the task at hand, and I think that's where we have to, each of us, have our role in it. Super quick. Sorry.
No, thanks, Åsa. Thank you very much. Thank you for braving the stage, for being self-critical, for raising those uncomfortable truths that we need to hear in this room. We will now have a coffee break for 45 minutes, so the program will resume at 4:30. And it will be on weathering the storm, locally led financing mechanisms. But before you all leave for the coffee break, please give a warm hand of applause to our panelists. Yeah.